He had walked this trail enough times that the distance had become automatic. 4 miles from the gravel lot to the fire tower and 4 miles back. The terrain was predictable. The first mile ran flat through mixed hardwood. The trail surface compacted dirt with a thin layer of decomposing leaf matter that compressed without sound underfoot in dry conditions. After rain, it had a faint tackiness, a slight resistance before releasing each step, but today had been dry for 6 days, and the surface was firm and silent. The second mile began a gradual ascent along a ridge, and here the trail composition shifted to exposed root systems and patches of bare rock, a pale grey schist that rang faintly under a hard heel strike. The third mile descended briefly into a drainage before climbing again through a stand of eastern hemlock, and the ground here stayed damp regardless of weather, a layer of brown needles that absorbed impact completely. The fourth mile was the steepest, a series of switchbacks through thinning canopy up to the tower clearing, and the trail there was loose shale that moved underfoot and produced a distinct sliding crunch with every step. He had learned the acoustic signature of each section. He did not think of it in those terms, but the knowledge was there, in the same way a commuter knows the sound of a particular highway exit or a homeowner recognizes the specific creak of a staircase. The trail had a sound profile, and his body had memorized it. It was early October, and the light was beginning to change. Not the color so much as the angle. By 3 in the afternoon, the sun sat low enough that the trail ahead was bisected into alternating bands of warm light and deep shadow, and this gave the forest a quality of visual rhythm, a repeating pattern of illumination and darkness that made distance harder to judge. He had started at 1:30. He expected to reach the tower by 3:15, spend 20 minutes, and begin the return. He would be back at the lot before 5, which gave him 40 minutes of daylight margin. He carried a small pack with water, a rain shell, and a headlamp he had never needed. The pack was well fitted and did not shift on his back. He wore trail shoes with a moderate tread pattern, the lugs partially worn from use, but still functional. He had owned them for 2 seasons. They were broken in to the point where he no longer thought about them, which is the point at which footwear becomes invisible. His gait was consistent. He walked at roughly 3 miles per hour on flat ground, slightly less on the ascents, and his stride length was unremarkable. He did not use trekking poles. His arms swung naturally, and the only sound he generated was the contact of sole on surface, which varied by section as described. The forest was quiet in the way. October forests are quiet when the insects have died back and the birds have thinned, but the wind has not yet arrived. There was no wind. The canopy was mostly still. Occasionally, a single leaf detached and fell in the erratic spiraling pattern of a broad, flat object descending through still air. These events were visible, but nearly inaudible. The dominant sound was his own movement. He was not listening for anything. He was not anxious or alert. He was in the particular mental state that a familiar, repetitive physical activity produces, a state in which the mind is neither focused nor wandering, but simply running at a low idle, processing sensory input without commentary. He noticed things without naming them. The temperature was in the low 50s. The air was dry. The light was doing what it always did at this time of year. He was comfortable. The first mile passed without event. He stopped once to drink water, tightened the cap, replaced the bottle in the side pocket of the pack, and continued. The trail was exactly as he expected it to be. He knew where the routes crossed, where the slight erosion had created a shallow channel that ran diagonally across the path, where the trail widened near a large glacial boulder before narrowing again. Everything was in its place. He began the second mile and registered the change in surface beneath his feet, the transition from soft dirt to the harder substrate of the ridge. His footfalls acquired the faint mineral ring of the schist. It was not loud. It was a subtle tonal shift, the difference between a muted thud and something with a fractional brightness to it, as though the ground had a thin resonance that the dirt had lacked. He had noticed this many times before. It was one of the features of the trail that made it feel structured, like a piece of music with movements. He was approximately a quarter mile into the ridge section when he became aware of something he could not immediately categorize. It was not a new sound. That was what made it difficult to identify. It was not the introduction of an unfamiliar element into the environment. It was more like a doubling, as though one of the existing sounds had acquired a faint additional layer, a secondary instance that was almost but not perfectly aligned with the primary one. The way a very slight reverb can make a single clap sound as though it occurred in a space slightly larger than the one you are standing in. He did not stop. He did not change his pace. He simply noticed it, the way you notice a car in your peripheral vision that may or may not be in the lane next to yours. It registered as a flicker of attention, a momentary sharpening of auditory focus that passed almost immediately. The sound, if it was a distinct sound, seemed related to his footsteps. This was the most natural interpretation. He was walking on a hard surface. Hard surfaces produce reflections. The ridge ran along a slope, and to his left, the terrain dropped away through trees, and to his right, it rose to a low rock outcrop that paralleled the trail for several hundred feet. A rock wall to one side, an open drop to the other. It was a geometry that could plausibly produce a brief echo or reflection, a return of his own footfall sound from the outcrop face, arriving a fraction of a second after the original. He considered this passively, without stopping. It seemed reasonable. He had walked this section many times and had not noticed it before, but that did not mean it had not been there. Acoustic conditions change. Humidity affects sound propagation. The leaf canopy was thinner now than it had been in summer, and this altered the reflective properties of the space. A sound that might have been absorbed in July could conceivably bounce in October. He accepted this and continued walking. The sound persisted. It was quiet. It sat just at the edge of audibility, at the threshold where perception and imagination begin to overlap. He could hear it most clearly on the harder patches of trail where his own footsteps had the most definition. On softer ground, where his steps were more muffled, the secondary sound also diminished, which was consistent with an echo explanation. Quieter source, quieter reflection. This made sense. He walked another few minutes. The rock outcrop to his right ended, replaced by a normal wooded slope. He noted this transition without thinking about it. The trail was still hard-packed, with intermittent rock exposure. The sound did not stop. He noticed this only because the geometry had changed. The reflective surface was gone. The outcrop was behind him now, perhaps 200 feet back. He was walking through open forest with no significant vertical surfaces on either side. The nearest feature that could plausibly return a reflection was the trunk of a large red oak about 15 feet to his right, and a tree trunk of that diameter would not produce a coherent echo of a footstep. It would scatter the sound. The reflection, if it was a reflection, should have ceased when the outcrop ended. He slowed slightly, not consciously. It was the kind of deceleration that occurs when a person's attention redirects from navigation to perception, when the processing priority shifts and the body responds by reducing its own noise output. He was listening now, not intently, not with alarm, but with a focus he had not had 30 seconds earlier. His footsteps fell on packed dirt with patches of exposed stone. Each step produced a clear sound, and with each step, there was a second sound, closely matched, that appeared to come from somewhere behind him and slightly to the left. The interval between the two was very small. It was the kind of gap that could be a reflection from a surface roughly 15 to 20 feet away, based on the speed of sound and the perceived delay. But there was no surface at that distance. He looked. Trees, open ground cover, a mild slope, nothing that should send sound back in that specific way. He stopped. The sound stopped. This was unremarkable. If the sound was linked to his movement, of course it would stop when he stopped. An echo stops when the source stops. A gear shift settles when the body settles. He stood still for perhaps 5 seconds, listening. The forest was quiet. No wind, no movement except a distant woodpecker, its pattern recognizable and sporadic, far off to the east and irrelevant. He resumed walking. The sound resumed. He walked at his normal pace for perhaps 30 steps, and during that span, he focused his attention entirely on the secondary sound. It was consistent. It fell with each step. It did not fall between steps. The rhythm was his rhythm. The volume was lower than his own footsteps, but not dramatically so. It sounded like a person walking on a similar surface at a moderate distance, perhaps 30 or 40 feet behind him. He did not turn around. This was not a decision based on fear or avoidance. He simply had not yet reached the point where turning around felt necessary. The sound was subtle. It was probably explicable. The trail was public, and while he had not seen another hiker today, it was not impossible that someone had started after him and was now within earshot. A person walking at a slightly faster pace could have closed the distance. The trail was narrow enough that sound would channel along it efficiently. The trees on either side formed a natural corridor. A person 40 feet behind him would sound exactly like this. He continued walking. He listened. The secondary footsteps maintained their pace, matching his exactly, step for step. He counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each of his steps accompanied by its double. He did not speed up. He did not slow down. He simply walked and counted and listened, compiling data without drawing conclusions. After perhaps a minute of this, he made a small adjustment. He shortened his stride by roughly 4 inches, which reduced his pace without requiring him to slow his leg turnover significantly. The effect was a slight decrease in speed and a slight change in the rhythm of his footfalls. The interval between steps compressed marginally. The secondary sound adjusted. The new interval matched. It happened within 2 or 3 steps, the kind of synchronization that a person walking behind him might achieve naturally. If someone was behind him, walking at the same pace, they would naturally adjust to a pace change. This was normal. People in proximity tend to synchronize their gait. It is an unconscious social behavior, documented and unremarkable. He lengthened his stride again. The sound matched. He slowed noticeably, reducing his pace by perhaps 20%. He did this over several steps, a gradual deceleration. The sound decelerated with him, not abruptly, gradually, matching the rate of change, not just the endpoint. When he reached the slower pace and held it, the sound held it too. He walked at this reduced speed for about 30 seconds. Then he accelerated back to his original pace, doing so in a single step rather than gradually. One step at the slow pace, the next at the fast pace. A discrete jump in rhythm rather than a smooth transition. The sound jumped with him. He felt a change in his attention. It was not fear. It was the particular cognitive sharpening that occurs when a pattern does something unexpected. The gradual matching had been easy to attribute to another hiker. The instantaneous matching was harder. A person walking behind him, who was unconsciously synchronizing their gait, would track gradual changes smoothly, but would not replicate an abrupt change on the very next step. There would be a reaction time, a stumble, a half step of adjustment. The sound had shown none of that. It had changed from one rhythm to the other, as though both his feet and the source of the sound were controlled by the same signal. He continued walking at his normal pace. He was still on the ridge section. The trail ahead curved gently to the left and began the descent toward the drainage. He could see the transition in the tree composition, the hardwoods giving way to the darker, denser hemlocks. The trail surface would change there, from hard-packed dirt and rock to soft needle cover. He was perhaps 200 yards from that transition. He decided to perform a more deliberate test. He walked for 10 steps at his normal pace. On the 11th step, he stopped. Not a gradual stop, a full stop, mid-stride, planting his right foot and holding position without putting his left foot down. He stood on one leg, his left foot suspended a few inches above the trail, his body slightly forward, frozen in the middle of a step. The sound stopped at the same instant, not a fraction of a second later, not with the slight lag of a reflected sound. At the same instant, as though the same foot that stopped his forward motion also stopped the secondary sound. They were the same event. He held the position for 3 seconds, 4, 5. His balance was good, but the position was not natural to hold. And at 6 seconds, he set his left foot down, completing the step. As his left foot touched the ground, the sound produced one additional footfall. 1. Perfectly timed to his delayed step. Then silence. He stood still, both feet on the ground, weight evenly distributed. He was breathing slightly harder than the exertion warranted. Though he did not notice this, the forest was quiet. The woodpecker had stopped. There was no wind. The light had not changed. Everything was exactly as it had been for the past hour, except that a sound was matching his movement with a fidelity that he could not attribute to an echo, a following hiker, or equipment noise. He turned around. The trail behind him was empty. It stretched back along the ridge, curving gently to the right from this perspective. Dappled in the alternating pattern of light and shadow, he could see clearly for perhaps 100 yards before the curve took the trail out of sight. There was no one on it, no movement, no sign of recent disturbance. The leaf litter on the trail margins was undisturbed. There were no fresh impressions in the softer sections of dirt. He stood looking back for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he turned forward and resumed walking. The sound resumed with his first step. He did not stop again. He walked steadily toward the drainage crossing. And as he walked, he listened with the kind of attention he normally reserved for identifying bird calls or tracking the direction of a distant sound. A focused, analytical listening in which each auditory event was isolated and examined. The secondary footsteps had the same tonal quality as his own. This was notable. His footsteps on the hard ridge surface had a particular character, a brief, dry impact with a slight mineral brightness from the schist. The secondary sound had this same character. It was not a generic footstep sound. It had the specific spectral signature of a foot in a trail shoe striking this particular surface. This argued against it being an echo, because an echo from a natural surface would be filtered. The high frequencies absorbed more than the lows, producing a duller, softer version of the original. This sound was not duller. It was not softer in quality, only in volume. It was as though the same step was being produced at the same location, but with less force. He reached the drainage crossing. The trail dipped, and the surface changed to the hemlock needle bed. His footsteps became nearly silent, soft compressions with no impact sound. The air was cooler here, the canopy dense enough to block most of the afternoon light. The secondary sound changed with the surface. It became the same soft compression, barely audible, but present. He could hear it because the environment was so quiet, and because he was now listening for it specifically. A faint doubling of each step, as though the needle bed were being compressed twice in rapid succession. He stopped in the middle of the drainage. The hemlock stand was dark and still. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. A thin stream crossed the trail here, no more than 6 inches wide, running silently over smooth stones. He stood at the edge of the stream and held still. Silence. Complete. The sound had stopped with him. He lifted his right foot and held it above the ground for a moment, then set it down on the opposite side of the stream, a single step across the water. As his foot landed on the needle bed on the far side, there were two sounds, his step and the second step, both on needle bed, both with the same muffled quality. But the stream was between him and where the sound appeared to originate. He had stepped over the stream. The sound appeared to have stepped over nothing. It came from behind him, from the same side of the stream he had just left, or perhaps from neither side, or perhaps from directly beneath him. The spatial quality of the sound had become difficult to localize. Earlier, on the ridge, it had seemed to come from a consistent point behind and to his left. Now, it seemed less fixed. Not louder, not closer, just less anchored to a specific direction. He crossed the drainage and began the climb through the hemlocks toward the switchbacks. The trail steepened, his breathing deepened, and his pace slowed naturally with the grade. His footsteps were still quiet on the needles, but became slightly heavier as his effort increased. The secondary sound tracked every change: the heavier steps, the slower pace, the slight variation in rhythm that comes from navigating uneven terrain on an incline, where each step requires a fractionally different placement and produces a fractionally different sound. The secondary sound replicated these variations, not in a general way, not as a rough approximation of his rhythm, but step for step, variation for variation, as though it had access to the same terrain under the same feet. He climbed steadily. The hemlocks began to thin. The trail surface transitioned to the loose shale of the upper switchbacks, and his footsteps acquired the sliding crunch that characterized this section. Each step had two phases: the initial placement, a brief contact sound, followed by a slight slide as the loose surface shifted under load, producing a secondary grinding that lasted perhaps a quarter second. It was a complex sound, not a simple impact. The secondary sound reproduced both phases: the contact and the slide, the duration of the slide, the specific grinding quality of the shale. He could hear it clearly now, because the shale was loud, and the spacing between the two sounds, his and the other, was consistent enough that they did not blur together. They were offset by a tiny interval, just enough to be perceived as two events rather than one. He stopped on a switchback and stood facing uphill. The trail behind him descended at a visible angle, a pale ribbon of loose stone cutting back and forth across the slope. He could see three switchback legs below him. They were empty. The forest on either side was open, the understory sparse at this elevation, mostly low blueberry bushes already turned red, and bare mountain laurel. Visibility was good. There was nothing on the trail and nothing in the trees. He turned back uphill and took a single step. One step, controlled, deliberate. Two sounds, his and the other. The other came from behind, from below, from the switchback leg he had just climbed. The direction was clear this time. It was behind and below, as though someone were on the previous switchback, matching his step. But he had just looked. There was no one there. He took another step, the same doubling. He took three quick steps in succession, faster than his climbing pace, almost jogging. Three quick doubles, perfectly spaced. No stumble, no lag, no variation. Three steps and three shadows of steps. And the shadows were not delayed by the time it would take sound to travel from the lower switchback to his position. At a distance of perhaps 60 feet, the speed of sound would introduce a delay of roughly 55 milliseconds. He would not normally notice 55 milliseconds, but in the context of his heightened attention, he felt certain the delay was not present. The two sounds were effectively simultaneous. He could not make that work with any physical model he understood. A sound source 60 feet away cannot arrive simultaneously with a local sound. It arrives later. Always. This is not a matter of conditions or acoustics. It is a constraint of physics. The speed of sound is not infinite. The distance was not zero. Therefore, the delay should exist. It did not. He stood on the switchback and thought about this. He did not think about it in terms of fear or threat. He thought about it as a problem. He reviewed the possibilities. Echo. He had effectively ruled this out. The timing was wrong, the tonal quality was wrong, and the geometric conditions were wrong. Echoes require reflective surfaces at appropriate distances, and while the environment provided some, the sound persisted across all terrain types and geometries, including open forest with no significant reflectors. Another hiker. He had looked multiple times now. There was no one on the trail behind him. The visibility was good. The trail was narrow, and the sight lines on the switchbacks were long. A person would be visible. Equipment noise. His pack was well fitted and did not shift. He carried nothing that rattled or clicked. His clothing did not produce audible sound when he walked. His shoes were the only sound source on his body, and they produced a single, locatable sound at ground level. The secondary sound was also at ground level, but behind him, acoustic anomaly, some localized property of the terrain that produced an unusual sound propagation pattern. This was the most generous explanation remaining. He did not have enough knowledge of acoustics to rule it out entirely, but the consistency of the phenomenon across 4 different surface types, compacted dirt, bare rock, hemlock needles, and loose shale, made it difficult to accept. An anomaly specific enough to produce this effect on one surface would be unlikely to reproduce it on a fundamentally different surface with different acoustic properties. Animal. A large animal, perhaps a deer, moving through the forest at the same pace. He had not seen one. Deer do not typically pace hikers. Their gait pattern is fundamentally different from a human's, a 4-beat pattern versus 2. He was hearing 2-beat movement, left, right, left, right, not the quadruped stagger of a deer. He exhausted his hypotheses. None of them held. He stood on the loose shale and felt the particular stillness that occurs when every available explanation has been tested and discarded, and the phenomenon continues to exist without one. It was not a comfortable stillness, though it was the cognitive equivalent of standing in an empty room after the last piece of furniture has been removed. Everything he might rest his understanding on had been taken away, and what remained was just the bare fact. A sound was matching his movement with a precision that nothing in his experience could account for. He resumed climbing. He had a mile left to the tower, and the trail continued its switchback pattern up the shale slope. The late afternoon light was angled and golden, catching the loose stone and giving it a warm, almost sandy appearance. The shadows of the bare mountain laurel bushes lay across the trail in thin, crooked lines. He walked, and the sound walked. He tried something new. Instead of varying his pace or stopping, he altered the quality of his step. He placed his right foot with exaggerated care, rolling from heel to toe in a slow, controlled motion that minimized the shale displacement and produced a quieter, smoother sound than his normal step. His left foot he placed normally, with his usual weight and the usual sliding crunch. Right foot, quiet, smooth. Left foot, loud, crunching. Right foot, quiet, smooth. Left foot, loud, crunching. The secondary sound differentiated. It reproduced the quiet right step and the loud left step. Not approximately, exactly. The same two-phase pattern. One step muffled and controlled. The next step full and unrestrained, alternating in perfect correspondence with his own intentional variation. He had not varied his footfall quality on this trail before. This was not a pattern the environment had previously been exposed to. This was not a pattern that could be the residual acoustic signature of a previous visit or a quirk of the terrain's response to a standard gate. He had invented this pattern 30 seconds ago, and the sound was reproducing it. He felt something shift in the way he was processing the experience. It was not a sudden change. It was more like a recalibration, the slow adjustment of a lens, bringing a new focal plane into clarity, while the previous one blurs. The category in which he had been holding this event, acoustic anomaly, strange but explicable, had become untenable. He was not yet ready to assign a new category. He was in the space between categories, where a thing simply is what it is, and no framework contains it. He continued the alternating pattern for 20 more steps. The sound followed it perfectly. Then he reversed it. Right foot loud, left foot quiet. The sound reversed with him. No transition, no stumble, no beat of confusion. Instantaneous, as though there were no learning curve, no reaction time, no processing lag between the detection of his change and the reproduction of it. He dropped the pattern and walked normally. The sound returned to its normal doubling, both feet even, both feet producing the standard shale crunch. He walked faster. The sound walked faster. He walked slower. The sound walked slower. He stopped. The sound stopped. He started again, and as his right foot left the ground and swung forward through the air, before it contacted the shale, before it had completed the step, the sound produced a footfall. He stopped. He stood completely still, his right foot planted on the shale where it had landed, his left foot behind him, and he reconstructed what had just happened. He had initiated a step. His foot had left the ground. During the swing phase, while his foot was in the air and had not yet landed, the secondary sound had produced the sound of a completed step. The impact, the slide, the full acoustic event of a foot striking shale. Before his foot touched down, he did not move. He stood on the switchback in the golden afternoon light and held absolutely still and replayed the moment in his mind. He was certain the sound had preceded the completion of his step, not by much, perhaps 200 milliseconds, but it had been ahead. It had not mirrored his movement. It had anticipated it. He thought about that word, anticipated. He did not like it. Anticipation implies prediction, and prediction implies a model, and a model implies something doing the modeling. He did not want to follow that chain of reasoning. He set it aside. He stood still for a long time, perhaps a full minute. The forest was quiet. The light was declining. He could feel the temperature dropping, the way it does on exposed ridgelines when the sun angle drops below a certain point, and the radiant heat loss outpaces the ambient warming. He needed to keep moving. He had a turnaround time and a daylight margin to respect. He began walking again. The sound began with him. He did not test it further. He did not vary his pace or his stride or the quality of his footfalls. He walked normally, steadily, at his standard climbing pace, and he let the sound exist beside him, beneath him, behind him, wherever it was, without engaging with it. He gave it no more experiments. He climbed. The final half mile to the tower passed without any additional anomaly in the sound's behavior. But the sound itself continued. Every step doubled. Every pause matched. He reached the clearing at the base of the fire tower at 3:22, 7 minutes later than his usual arrival, and he stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at the tower. It was a standard 60-foot steel structure, The cab at the top reached by a series of zigzag staircases with metal grate steps. He had climbed it many times. He walked across the clearing. The surface was close-cropped grass and bare dirt, maintained by the fire service. His footsteps were nearly silent on the grass. The secondary sound was nearly silent on the grass. It was there, a faint compression, a whisper of flattened blades, doubled, still present, still matched. He reached the base of the tower and stopped. He put his hand on the metal railing of the first staircase. He stood there for 10 seconds, considering. He did not climb the tower. He had never skipped the tower before. It was the destination. It was the reason for the hike. The view from the cab was the reward. The long panorama of ridges and valleys extending to the horizon in every direction. The particular satisfaction of elevation gained through effort. But today, he did not climb it. He stood at the base with his hand on the railing and made a decision that he did not fully articulate to himself, a decision that bypassed language and operated at the level of some older, less verbal assessment process. He turned around. He walked back across the clearing. The sound accompanied him. He re-entered the trees and began the descent. Going down on the shale switchbacks required a different gait than going up. More braking, more careful placement, shorter steps to manage the loose surface. His footsteps sounded different, more tentative, with longer slides as the shale shifted under the deceleration forces. The secondary sound reproduced this, not the ascending gait, the descending gait, the new gait, the one he was producing now, in real time on this specific descent, with its particular demands and variations. He descended through the switchbacks and entered the hemlock drainage. The sound softened with the surface. He crossed the stream and climbed the short rise on the other side. The sound crossed with him. He regained the ridge and walked along the flat section where the outcrop paralleled the trail on his right. The sound was there. It had been there for the entire return. It had been there on every surface, through every transition, across every change in terrain and gait and pace. The light was lower now. The bands of sun and shadow on the trail had merged into a more uniform dimness as the sun dropped toward the ridgeline to the west. The air was cooler. He could see his breath forming faintly, very faintly, in the moments when he exhaled through his mouth. The forest smelled of cold earth and decaying leaves and the faint sharpness of tannin. He was on the first mile, the flat section through the hardwoods, the compacted dirt and leaf matter that compressed without sound. His footsteps were nearly inaudible to him. He walked quietly on the quiet surface in the quiet forest. The secondary sound was also nearly inaudible, but it was there. He could hear it, or he believed he could hear it, which at this point had become a distinction without a practical difference. It was a presence at the absolute floor of perception, a sound that might have been real and might have been the auditory system straining to find what it expected, generating phantom input to satisfy a pattern that the brain had been tracking for over 2 hours. He reached the gravel lot at 4:43. His car was the only vehicle. The gravel was coarse and produced a loud, clear crunch underfoot, the most acoustically prominent surface of the entire hike. He walked across the lot toward his car. The crunching doubled, each step clear and separate, his and the other. The gravel was unambiguous. There was no room for ambiguity on gravel. It was the loudest, most definitive surface he had walked on today, and the secondary sound was right there, step for step, matching the particular quality of boot on coarse stone with a clarity that the softer trail surfaces had allowed him to question. But the gravel did not. He reached his car. He opened the door. He sat in the driver's seat and pulled the door closed. The door sealed with a solid click, and the interior of the car was suddenly completely quiet. The acoustic environment changed in an instant from the open, uncontained space of the outdoors to the small, padded, sealed space of a vehicle. He sat in the silence. He sat for a long time. He did not start the engine. He looked through the windshield at the gravel lot and the trailhead sign and the first few yards of trail disappearing into the trees. The light was fading. The lot was empty. He reached for the key, and as he did, he shifted his weight in the seat. His jacket compressed against the seat back. His shoes scraped faintly on the floor mat. Small sounds, the sounds of a body adjusting in a small space. From somewhere, from the direction of the trail, or the gravel, or the space outside the car, there was a faint, corresponding compression, a faint, corresponding scrape, muffled by the sealed doors and the glass and the insulation of the vehicle, but structured, timed. He started the engine. The engine noise filled the cabin and obscured everything else. He put the car in gear and pulled out of the lot and drove the 7 miles of gravel road to the paved highway, and then the 12 miles of highway to his house. He did not turn the radio on. He did not roll down the windows. He drove with the engine noise as the only sound. And it was enough. And it was consistent. And it did not double. He parked in his driveway and turned the engine off. The silence returned. He sat in it for a moment, then opened the door and stepped out onto the concrete. One step, his left foot landing on the hard surface as he exited the vehicle. A clear, defined sound in the still evening air. The sound his foot made on the concrete was singular. One step, one sound. He stood in his driveway in the early dark and waited. He took another step, one sound, another, one sound. He walked to his front door, 6 steps on the concrete path, and each step was singular, unaccompanied, the way a footstep has sounded for every step of every walk he has taken in his life, except today. He went inside. He set his back down. He drank a glass of water and removed his shoes and sat in the chair in his living room. The house was quiet. He sat in the quiet and did not turn on the television or any music. He sat and listened to the house, which sounded the way it always sounds. The refrigerator cycling, the faint tick of the baseboard heaters, the settling noises of a wood frame structure responding to the temperature differential between day and night. He sat for a long time. Eventually, he stood up and walked to the kitchen in his socks on the hardwood floor. His footsteps were soft, the particular padded sound of cotton on finished wood. Each step was singular. He walked back to the living room. Singular. He walked to the bathroom. Singular. He paced the length of the hallway, 16 steps from end to end. And each step was one sound, and one sound only. And the hallway did not double anything. And the house was normal. And the floor was normal. And the sounds were normal. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened. The house settled. The heater ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the road, the sound rising and falling with the Doppler shift. Normal sounds in a normal house on a normal night. He closed his eyes. He was almost asleep when a thought arrived, not as a fear, but as a simple, clear observation. The kind of thought that presents itself with the authority of something that has already been decided. He would walk the trail again, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps later in the week. He would return to the gravel lot and start at the trailhead and walk the 4 miles to the tower. He would walk the compacted dirt and the schist ridge and the hemlock drainage and the shale switchbacks. He would walk all 4 surface types in order, the way he always did. And he would be listening from the first step. He lay in the dark and knew, with the particular certainty that comes not from evidence, but from pattern, that the sound had not originated on the trail. It had been noticed on the trail. Those were different things, and the difference between them was the distance between a place where something begins and a place where something becomes loud enough to hear.